You've probably watched world record attempts and admired the limits of human potential. Today's stories are the exact opposite. Reckless, bizarre, and unbelievably stupid. From a man who chain-smoked cigars for 3 days in a closed garage, to a college student who chugged 28 energy drinks in a single afternoon, ending his record attempt in the most unexpected way possible. It was September 14, 2016, in a converted garage on the outskirts of Chiang Mai, Thailand. Nothing about the structure announced what was building inside it, just a man, a closed door, and nearly 3 days of decisions that each felt smaller than the last. Prasit Niran was 48, and his goal was to complete an unofficial endurance world record for the longest continuous cigar smoking session. The archive he planned to submit to accepted time-stamped video updates, witness statements, and continuous documentation in place of an official adjudicator, making the challenge inexpensive enough for him to attempt on his own. His rules were simple: remain inside the garage, stay awake, smoke one cigar after another with only brief breaks for food and water, and document his progress every few hours. He estimated the attempt would last just under 70 hours if everything went according to plan. It sounded less like a stunt to him than a test of patience, consistency, and endurance. What boggles my mind is he had converted his garage weeks earlier, sealed 2 windows with foam board, and kept the garage door shut. It's unclear in the report why the garage was sealed, but the most speculated reason is to stop neighbors complaining from the smoke. His younger brother, Chalerm, arrived every 4 to 5 hours with bottled water, boxed meals, the cigars Prasit had asked him to bring before the attempt began, and a phone for time-stamped video clips. Each time Chalerm opened the garage door to bring in supplies, fresh air briefly entered before it was shut again. That arrangement made the attempt feel documented and therefore legitimate, the kind of logic that holds until it doesn't. What he did not schedule around was the garage itself. 2 sealed windows meant the smoke from 67 hours spent repeatedly smoking cigars had nowhere to go. Additionally, Prasit added caffeine pills to a body that had barely slept and was behind on fluids. At the 60-hour mark, he mentioned chest tightness and numbness in his left arm to Chalerm before laughing it off as staying awake side effects. Chalerm later admitted that he was concerned, but thought his brother knew what he was doing. I don't fault Chalerm for not forcing the issue. You cannot compel someone to end something they have built 3 days of purpose around. But I think about what it feels like to drive away from that conversation knowing something is wrong and having no clean word for it yet. By hour 67, shortly after 2 in the morning, Chalerm arrived with a cigar Prasit had insisted he bring and had his phone out for a progress update. Prasit was mid-sentence talking about his hour count when he stopped. His posture briefly stiffened, then went slack. He dropped to one knee, then collapsed backward onto the concrete floor. The lit cigar stayed between his fingers for several seconds before rolling free. Chalerm told emergency dispatch that the sound was not a crash, it was a settling. Slow and unresisted, the kind of movement that doesn't announce itself. Prasit's breathing became audible almost immediately. Irregular, widely spaced, nothing like sleep. Chalerm was on the phone with emergency services within seconds. The dispatcher guided him through CPR, which he performed on the same concrete floor where he had been handing over bottled water for 3 days. It's hard to imagine what it takes to stay functional in that moment, to follow instructions over the phone while your hands are already doing something no one prepares for. Emergency responders continued the resuscitation on scene and during transport, but Prasit was pronounced dead at a regional medical facility shortly after arrival. A forensic pathologist determined that Prasit died from cardiac arrest. Investigators found he had an undiagnosed heart condition, and 67 hours of sustained physiological strain had pushed his heart beyond its limits. Chalerm later told relatives he still replayed that final conversation, wondering whether stopping Prasit at the 60-hour mark might have changed anything, even though investigators found no evidence anyone could have predicted the outcome. Can you imagine never getting your name into the record archive after 3 days spent working toward it, and the attempt became the only record that survived you? Some records, it turns out, aren't worth smoking yourself out for. Now, the next incident is quieter, hotter, and somehow even harder to justify, because at least Prasit was alone in his decision to keep going. It was July 8th, 2018, in a remote clearing near the foothills of Mount Makiling, Laguna, Philippines. What happened over the next 4 hours did not break at once. It unraveled in small, manageable-looking increments until the last one was not manageable at all. Arnel Cordero was 42 and worked as a warehouse supervisor at a regional logistics firm in Laguna. He managed shift rotations, ran floor briefings, and organized camping trips for close friends several times a year, always with gear lists and printed schedules. Earlier that year, he had begun reading about world records and decided to build and attempt one of his own. Arriving at the clearing that morning with 3 longtime friends, a tightly sealed tarp and blanket tent, and a session timer. It's easy to see why he believed careful planning could make something this risky feel safe, but that's exactly where people get trapped. The tent measured roughly 6 feet by 4 feet and was sealed as tightly as they could manage, with no ventilation by design. River stones reheated over a nearby fire were added at timed intervals. Water poured over them for steam. His goal was to remain inside the sealed, steam-filled tent longer than anyone else had reportedly managed, treating the attempt as a test of heat tolerance and endurance rather than a competition against another person. You couldn't pay me to climb into something designed to trap both heat and steam with no way for fresh air to get in. The first 90 minutes were controlled. Arnel checked in clearly, drank water, shifted position, and everything was logged. What the attempt had no provision for was any defined stopping point, no temperature limit, no medical standby, no rule requiring him to exit. Before climbing inside, Arnel had also instructed his friends not to open the enclosure or interrupt the attempt unless he specifically asked to stop. Around the 3rd hour, his responses slowed. Words came separated. One friend noted it. Another said he was probably just focused. Near the 4-hour mark, he stopped responding entirely. His name was called twice through the fabric. No answer. The timer kept running. What followed was close to 40 minutes of inaction. The group's reasoning was that waking him would ruin the attempt. I've gone through the friends' statements, and I cannot follow that logic to any conclusion that holds. 40 minutes is not hesitation, it is a sustained decision made while a man lies silent inside a sealed heat enclosure. When a friend finally unzipped the tent, the trapped air hit the outside immediately. Arnel was on his side. His skin was dry and intensely hot. His breathing came in short, audible pulls. There was vomit near his head. His eyes were partially open and did not track movement. The friends dragged him outside onto the grass. He did not move independently and did not respond when they shook his shoulder or called his name. His skin felt uniformly hot wherever they touched him. 2 friends poured water over him in alternating passes. A third removed a tarp layer and used it to fan him. His skin remained intensely hot despite repeated cooling efforts. His responsiveness did not return. Within roughly 2 minutes, his body went into a brief, convulsive episode, arms and legs without coordination, then went completely still. His breathing remained shallow. One friend ran toward the main road to flag down a vehicle. Local emergency services arrived approximately 20 minutes later, delayed by the rough access road through the tree line. Paramedics documented profound hyperthermia consistent with severe heat stroke on arrival and transported him to a provincial hospital in Calamba. He died several hours after admission. The attempt ended there, and because Arnel never completed the challenge, the unofficial record was never recognized. Authorities treated the incident as a tragic accident, and no charges were filed against his friends. Look, I don't know about you, but climbing into a sealed heat enclosure with no thermometer, no stopping point, and no medical backup isn't something I'd ever call a good idea. Our next victim had no friends around him, and when the mountain finally decided it was done waiting, not a single person on the surface even knew yet. It was November 2, 2019. In the limestone karst country outside a protected national park in Sarawak, Malaysia, on a private landholding where no permit was required and no ranger would check. By the time anyone understood something had gone wrong, the rain had already done what rain in that terrain always eventually does. Hafiz Adam Rahman was 37. He had been caving recreationally for 6 years and was known among his local caving club for keeping detailed trip logs, entry times, estimated passage dimensions, battery levels, food quantities. You've got to respect that level of discipline, because most people wouldn't even come close to preparing this much. His objective was an unofficial world record attempt to remain alone inside the cave longer than anyone he had found documented. After nearly 2 years of planning and longer practice trips, he entered with enough supplies for 5 days, daily check-in plans, and a tested underground camping setup, making the attempt appear carefully prepared. What he did not bring was a satellite communicator, and what he could not account for was the rainfall accumulation rate in a drainage basin he had never mapped during wet season. The distinction between those two gaps would become the whole story. The second evening, after returning to the cave entrance, his check-in text reached his sister as expected. By the third morning, heavy overnight rain had been running down the surrounding limestone hills for roughly 9 hours. Limestone karst rapidly channels rainwater through fractures and underground conduits, causing low passages and cave streams to flood with little warning. A club member who had visited the same system the prior dry season told recovery teams that the restriction near the entrance, a crawl-through section roughly 18 inches at its highest clearance, would have been the first passage to fill. That passage was the only route in or out. I find it almost unbearable to consider the specific moment someone realizes the exit is gone and there is no version of waiting it out that doesn't end badly. The flood debris recovered later told the story with more precision than any witness could. Hafiz had moved his supplies repeatedly, stacking them on progressively higher ground. Scratch marks were identified on a limestone shelf roughly 4 feet above the normal floor line. His battery packs were arranged deliberately used ones, separated from remaining ones. Food wrappers were grouped and set aside. None of this happened quickly. Recovery teams believed he may have remained alive for an extended period after the restriction became impassable. The water level, based on debris lines, had risen to roughly chest height in the larger chambers before stabilizing. Every attempt to reach the entrance would have required moving through a flooded crawlway in near or total darkness against current, with no visibility and no clearance above. The contusions found on his arms and hands during the post-mortem were consistent with repeated contact against submerged limestone. I don't know what that experience looks like from outside that passage, and I'm not sure the people who recovered him fully left it behind either. His sister reported him overdue when the evening text did not arrive. A local fire and rescue unit and volunteer cavers deployed the following morning. Cave divers could not safely enter until floodwaters receded sufficiently, which took 3 days. His body was recovered beyond the submerged restriction. To be fair, entering an unmapped cave alone in a flood-prone region without an emergency communicator wasn't preparation, it was overconfidence. His funeral was attended by colleagues from his firm and most of his caving club. The planned record attempt was abandoned after recovery efforts concluded. The cave has not been formally closed. Hafiz didn't choose his trap, the water chose it for him. The next one built his own, one candle at a time, and never noticed the room closing in. It was January 17th, 2014, inside a rented storage workshop on the west side of Toledo, Ohio, and a single measurable ambition, and ended with 2 men on their knees on a concrete floor, one on the phone and one counting compressions, while the daylight outside continued as though nothing had shifted at all. Rhett Kalin was 39 and worked as an electronics repair technician out of a small leased shop near the industrial edge of town. His regulars described him as methodical, the kind of technician who fixed things others had already written off. Outside of work, he collected novelty records, unusual pressings, promotional releases from defunct labels, formats most people had never heard of, kept in labeled sleeves in his apartment. The attempt was not sanctioned by any official record body, but Rhett claims that it was a world record attempt and had organized it with the same precision he brought to circuit boards. The goal was to extinguish the most candles by hand in a single session. Hundreds of candles were lined up across the workshop floor while 2 friends replaced burned down candles and kept count. To prevent drafts from affecting the attempt, Rhett kept the roll-up door and windows closed and left the ventilation off. This is the point where a single reasonable sounding decision starts accumulating silently into something far worse. The same enclosed space protecting the flames was trapping what those flames were producing. Several hundred candles burning in a poorly ventilated enclosed room for hours can produce dangerous levels of carbon monoxide when combustion becomes less efficient. And sure enough, after several hours, both assistants had developed headaches. That detail mattered more than it seemed. A headache is one of the earliest signs of carbon monoxide exposure. They stepped outside for fresh air, but treated it as a short break instead of an emergency, assuming Rhett wanted uninterrupted concentration. They left him alone inside with the candles still burning. Now, to be fair, I've asked myself what I would have done differently and I genuinely cannot say I would have read that headache as an emergency either. Nearly 25 minutes passed. When they pushed the door open on their return, the room was visibly hazy from hours of accumulated candle smoke and fine combustion particles with nowhere to go. Rhett was sitting on the floor in the same position. One assistant called his name across the room. Nothing. The first assumption was sleep. He was upright but slumped slightly, and they moved toward him expecting exhaustion. One shook his shoulder. No response. The other reached toward his face and registered the color of his skin off in a way that neither could immediately name. I don't think there is a clean word for what that particular realization feels like in real time. Both assistants described feeling dizzy within seconds of stepping back inside. They grabbed his arms and dragged him across the concrete and out through the doorway. One told investigators the ground felt like it was shifting slightly under his feet while they moved. Outside, Rhett did not respond to his name or to physical stimulation. He had been breathing shallowly when they first reached him. Then he stopped. One assistant called 911, the other began CPR. Emergency services arrived in approximately 7 minutes. Resuscitation continued on scene and during transport, but he never regained consciousness. The coroner's findings identified the cause of death as fatal carbon monoxide poisoning from prolonged exposure in an inadequately ventilated enclosed space. What makes this particular case hard to move past is that the hazard is not obscure knowledge. It is printed on product packaging and covered in standard home safety guidance. This was not a gap in available information, it was a gap in applying it. I think that distinction is the most uncomfortable part of the whole thing. The two assistants were not charged. The attempt was never formally documented. Rhett never moved from that floor. The danger came to him, quiet and invisible, while he sat still. The next one couldn't sit still if he tried, and the danger he built with every swing was anything but quiet. It was October 11th, 2013, on a private timber tract outside Eugene, Oregon. Two men with a clipboard would spend a long time trying to explain what they had watched. Luke Biancamano was 44 years old, a veteran forestry worker employed by a regional logging contractor since his mid-20s. He had a clean safety record and a reputation for endurance. What brought him to that property was specific. He believed the industry's shift toward chainsaws had quietly erased recognition of traditional axe skill, and he wanted to put a number on what he claims is a world record that exceeded any documented claim he had been able to find. He told his two co-workers the plan the night before and asked them to count. The record attempt was simple in concept but brutal in execution. To fell the most trees with nothing but a manual felling axe within a single continuous session without switching to powered equipment or stopping except for brief water breaks. It's easy to see why someone would want to prove a skill everyone else has stopped valuing still matters. The attempt began at 7:45 in the morning after Luke had marked his trees the evening before. He moved through the first group of mostly smaller diameter trees at a pace his co-workers described as controlled and clean, deliberate bite angles, managed swing weight, clean separations. The two men stayed outside the felling zone and recorded each completed tree on a clipboard. By early afternoon, he had felled more than 30 small trees, and neither man had any reason to be alarmed. If you were standing there, you'd probably think everything was going exactly according to plan. By mid-afternoon, the pace had slowed and his movement between positions had changed, not stumbling, but heavier and less precise than it had been that morning. Around 3 o'clock, one coworker walked within speaking distance and told him the count was already substantial and there was no requirement to continue. Luke said he was close. 40 minutes later, the second man said the same. I don't think either of them knew what to do when he walked back toward the trees anyway. The tree he worked on last was a much larger leaning fir near the eastern edge of the area. The lean was roughly 10 degrees off vertical, modest on paper, consequential in practice, and worse on a cut made by hands that had been swinging for over 8 hours. His coworkers later told investigators the cut had not looked right from where they stood, and investigators found the hinge was noticeably thicker on one side than the other. On a leaning tree, that condition can allow the trunk to pivot away from its intended fall line. The trunk began to move. It did not go where the notch had directed it. Luke stepped back as he had done dozens of times that day, but the slash underfoot dry branches, bark fragments, compressed debris from hours of felling gave out under his right boot as he pushed off. His left knee went down. His upper body followed. The trunk did not stop. The first coworker heard the impact before he had a clear line of sight. He described it to investigators as low and dense, not especially loud. Then there was no movement from Luke's position. Both men reached him within 30 seconds. The trunk had struck his right shoulder, driven him to the ground, and come to rest across his chest. They could not move it. Luke was conscious briefly, eyes open. One hand shifted once and then his breathing stopped. Fire and rescue personnel reached the remote property 22 minutes later, but he had already died. Luke was buried the following week at a small service attended by his crew, his two brothers, and former co-workers. The contractor posted no formal statement. I think the skill Luke was trying to honor was real. I also think it costs nothing to hear a warning from someone who has been watching you work for 6 hours and is still willing to say it. Now for our last story, nature had nothing to do with it. He never left his apartment, and everything that followed started with a can. It was March 22nd, 2015, in a second-floor apartment in Fort Collins, Colorado, when the afternoon light came in through the window and fell across a stack of aluminum cans that had no business being that tall. Landon Jacob Pruitt was 23 years old, an accounting graduate 6 months out of a state university and between jobs. He had a habit of submitting to novelty, online, world record databases, the kind that occupy the space between entertainment and genuine competition. And he treated those submissions with more seriousness than most people around him thought they warranted. That morning, he told his two roommates the day would be photographed and time-stamped. They agreed to help. The challenge was to consume the highest number of energy drinks within a single documented day. By mid-afternoon, 22 cans had been logged, the empties arranged along the kitchen counter. I think about someone sitting in an apartment genuinely believing this was a path to something, and I don't feel contempt. I feel a quiet, specific dread. Somewhere between the 17th and 18th drink, without telling either friend, Landon opened a tub of pre-workout powder he had purchased weeks earlier and mixed several scoops into a bottle of water and began taking them because he felt himself getting tired. For me, that decision to quietly add even more stimulants is the exact moment this stopped looking like a challenge and started looking like a disaster. By 5 in the afternoon, both roommates had started expressing concern. His hands were visibly shaking. He was pacing in tight loops and told them his heart wouldn't slow down. One friend told him to stop, then said it again. Landon said stopping at that point would waste the entire day. I hate that line, because once you've convinced yourself quitting means failure, you've already trapped yourself. By 7 in the evening, the apartment carried the kind of stillness both witnesses later described as uncomfortable without being able to say exactly why. His movements had become rigid and over-deliberate. The stack was 28 cans deep by the timestamp on the last photograph. I'm not sure either of them could have named what they were watching at that point. One friend was on the couch. The other stood near the kitchen doorway. Landon reached for another can and his grip loosened without warning. It dropped straight to the linoleum. Both friends looked at the can, then back at him. He was completely still, arms at his sides, jaw locked in a way that appeared involuntary. No one spoke. Then he went down, not a stumble, not a grab for the wall, straight down, and the seizure began on impact. His body moved against the linoleum with enough force to be heard in the apartment next door. Within roughly 90 seconds, his lips had gone blue and his breathing had become irregular and audible from across the room. One friend reached him immediately and rolled him onto his side. The other called emergency services from the kitchen doorway, still inside of the counter. I want to be direct. What both of those friends did in that moment was correct, and I think about the weight they carried out of that apartment. During transport, Landon experienced repeated cardiac arrhythmia, requiring multiple defibrillator attempts. Circulation was restored, but prolonged poor blood flow to his brain during the cardiac arrest had already caused severe and irreversible brain injury. He died the following afternoon in intensive care. His funeral was held the following week at a small church in his hometown. Both roommates were present. This whole incident, and honestly most of today's cases, are a reminder that some records are so pointless they're simply not worth gambling your life for, no matter how achievable they seem.